You're never done prepping because there's always one more scenario that you could make yourself robust to. When I meet a careful prepper, I'm meeting somebody who's wide awake. We do live in systems that we take for granted that are not stable. Yeah, the average person sort of thinks food comes from a supermarket. They don't know what the supermarket depends on, and that is where things get frightening. There's something about the structures of power that makes self-sufficiency difficult. Right? You're not allowed to do many of the things that would make you self-sufficient. You're declaring me unfree to do something that effectively I have a God-given right to do. That is perfectly insane. Anytime you see them target your rights, you should be alarmed and you should fight it. Your kids and your grandkids are going to regret it if you don't protect those things with everything you got. Once you realize the inmates are running the asylum, prepping makes a lot more sense.
World War III is already happening.
This is a house of cards, and it is in the process of collapsing right now.
You're going to see an economic crash the likes of which we've never seen.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Today on the channel, it's an honor to have Bret Weinstein, who's an evolutionary biologist, author, and podcaster known for exploring the dissonance between our ancient instincts and the rapid technological advancements of the 21st century. He co-authored A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century and hosts the Dark Horse podcast here on YouTube, where he examines science, culture, and the challenges of our rapidly changing world. He's a maverick in academic circles, and he challenges the conventional wisdom and pushes conversations into territories that others often avoid, often to his own detriment. Today, I hope to talk to him about AI, novelty, its relationship with cultural decline, the potential for civilizational collapse, and the role of survivalism in all of this. So you talk about, Bret, the mismatch between biology and technology in your book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, which I would strongly encourage people to purchase or go and get the audiobook. It's excellent. I'm wondering, as society becomes more complex, it seems like, at least in the West, this subculture of prepping has emerged. And it almost came about right after the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. We see in the 1970s and 80s the emergence of this survivalism, which is really reaching a fever pitch right around the COVID era and still persisting to this day. And it seems to coincide with the emergence of the digital age and all of these new technologies that are really complicating our life in a lot of ways. Where do you think preparedness fits in to your understanding of how technology is at odds with biology?
It's a very interesting question. I want to sort out the basics of the story, though, biologically first. Mm-hmm. Human beings are a shockingly unique species. Most species adapt to a particular opportunity that exists in the world. Human beings create novel opportunities, and they adapt to the niches that they open. So technology is, on the one hand, a product of biology. The way that we manage our biological conundrum is by innovating tech. But that tech creates a hazard, which is that whatever world we build, we didn't evolve there. And that creates a risk for our species. It is not the fact of novelty itself that's such a problem, because what I'm saying is that human beings are built for novelty. The problem is the rate of change. We are now altering the world so rapidly that not only is the world that you were a child in not the world that you will be an adult in, but if you live a normal length life, you will see the world revolutionized several times. That is not a rate of change that human beings can adapt to. So I think the answer to your question is this. We are built for a world, the one from which we come. We are well designed for it. When we alter it, we are building a house of cards. That house of cards inevitably comes apart based on our failure to anticipate the consequences of our modifications. And so there is always a concern that what we are doing cannot last, and a rational desire to be prepared for what happens when we realize what we're doing wrong. That has to be separated, though, from what's called a millenarian instinct, right? To predict that the end of the world is around the corner. That's also a permanent strategy, and maybe for the same reason. But the fact is, we're still here. So while the instinct to prepare is rational, it is easy to fall into a reflexive fear of change that I think is not productive.
Why do you think some people prepare and some people don't? Because there seems to be some alignment between what you do as a dissident voice, and I shouldn't say dissident voice. It's not like you're trying to be dissident. You're just trying to be rational in academia, which is wrought with all kinds of conformist tendencies. There seems to be some alignment with people like yourself and people who seek to be independent in how they live their lives, and almost as if motivated by some underlying dread about, this potential catastrophe as a result of this conformist behavior, which in many ways is detrimental in the long term.
Well, think about it this way. Evolution, for reasons I won't go deeply into, but evolution is basically a competition in which your genes try to predispose your structure and your behavior to get themselves as far into the future as they can. That's the game. And those who don't prep, those who pretend that civilization is going to go on in some continually upgraded form forever, those people have an advantage until things come apart. Competitively speaking, if you're prepping, you're spending a large fraction of your effort and your resources on things that don't pay off until something goes seriously wrong. At the point that something goes seriously wrong, the people who didn't prepare have a very serious problem. And so these two strategies are in competition with each other. And in the short term, the what me worry strategy wins. And in the long term, people like you and me understand that preparedness of some kind is bound to pay off. But will you and I live to see that moment? That's unclear.
Yeah, so you talk about how, there's a rapidity of change, and that this is perhaps approaching a crescendo with artificial intelligence. And so on the one hand, we have prepping that tends to rise with this complexity as a sort of knee-jerk reaction, as a sense of, you have these people who sense that, the situation is, the complexity is becoming intractable, and we have to do something. If AI is approaching this crescendo and technology is approaching this crescendo of complexity, what is the prepping analog of that? Because it seems like if we're approaching complexity on steroids, then there's going to be like this response to it. I've heard people, create theories as to there's going to be people who, just like the Amish or something, break off and just decide to remain in a state of, self-inflicted arrested development. What do you view the consequences of AI and and how do you expect people to respond to it?
Well, my biggest concern about AI is that we didn't prepare for it, that we did a lot of narrative construction. There's, of course, no shortage of sci-fi books and movies that ostensibly tell us something about it. But the reality of it is very concerning. The way that it is plugged into our consciousness. It'd be one thing if you had a computer that can outthink a human, but English wasn't its first language. That would be troubling in its own right, but safer. The problem is, as you well know, this thing talks to you like a person. And so that means it's plugged into not only your analytical capacities, but your emotional capacities. And I think it is dead certain that it is going to drive some fair fraction of the population nuts. Now, they may have been nuts already. They may have been nuts because the news media speaks English and it speaks through your television, you know, and looking at your television, the person speaking English to you looks like they're sitting in your living room. So it may be that we've already had a taste of this kind of insanity. But this is going to make things far worse because, at least with respect to something like the news in your living room, it's not tailored to you as an individual. This AI is already more tailored than we can handle, and it's going to become essentially perfectly tailored to you. It could be trained on your thoughts, and it could flatter you with compatible thoughts that make you feel like a genius, and it could do that for purposes that suit those who built it rather than those who use it. So that would be all in keeping with every example of high technology that we've seen in recent decades. So I think we should expect it. Do I expect people to go Amish? Yes. I think I'm a little worried that there wasn't more of a movement towards that at the beginning. When AI was released, everybody seemed to think that this was such a marvelous toy, they couldn't resist playing with it. And my feeling is we just crossed an event horizon. Nobody on Earth knows what's coming. You couldn't. It's not predictable. So the idea that everybody should be all in all at once is absurd. That's obviously not a rational plan. And we didn't set out any sort of guidelines to discover cognitive pathologies that arise downstream of this, which means that when they inevitably do, and maybe they already are, we don't have a warning system that will go off and say, hey, this is actually causing people to become delusional. So, I'm not surprised in the least that we ran headlong into this new universe without much preparation, but I am troubled by that fact. I know the right thing to do was to prepare ourselves thoroughly and figure out how you build, a contingency architecture, a set of people who are deliberately immunized from this and not punished economically for staying away from it, in order that somebody can look at the rest of us and say, oh, it's interesting. These belief structures for which there is no evidence seem to be rising, or these pathological behaviors seem to be on the increase. Something. We should be looking for that. And the point is there's no one to look because we're all using AI.
Is that possible, though, with the arms race component? I mean, you have individuals, you have corporations, you have nation states all competing to try to bring about the best model with the most compute haphazardly, potentially to all of our detriment. And for them to put those guardrails in place would obviously restrict them. And there's always that tragedy of the commons where, everybody is suspicious that, everybody else is going to be overstepping the boundaries, so they ought to as well. Was it possible for us to prepare for this?
Well, there's a difference. You're asking about regulation, which does fall into this exact problem with the tragedy of the commons, where if one group restrains itself, it's basically giving an advantage to those who don't. So, no, that would be pointless. And in fact, it would be profoundly counterproductive. On the other hand, preparing ourselves cognitively for what was coming was possible. That doesn't involve regulation. It just involves recognition of what the technology is likely to do. And again, the idea that it speaks to us in English, tailored to the way we think, so that it comes across as human as possible, is quite
weird.
A hazard. Well, it's weird, and I will say I don't know whether I should be interacting with it or not. I do, cautiously, sparingly. I never interact with it without thinking about this hazard. But I do make a point, maybe it's even just for me. I make a point of not saying please and not saying thank you and not interacting with it like a creature that I care about. And it's not even just a human. The care that I feel and behave with towards my pets, or even towards, a wild animal that I see and have some compassion for. I deliberately avoid doing that with AIs because my rule number one for these things is that's a new species and you know nothing about it. Unlike the species of Earth that we have been dealing with, all of those species come from the same evolutionary tree. And so you can look into, the eyes of a raccoon and have a pretty good guess that it knows that when it feels fear, it's a lot like the fear that you feel. We don't know anything about the AI, whether it feels, and I don't feel, lots of people are very comforted by the fact that it's not programmed to feel, it's just programmed to sound like it does. I'm not comforted by this at all, because what the technologists don't seem to grasp is that a human being, a child, is effectively an LLM. Not totally, it is other things as well. But a child goes from not being able to comprehend a word of its own language to being able to speak it fluently in a matter of years. It does that by doing more or less what an LLM does, and nobody doubts that a human being is conscious. So my point is, they didn't program it to feel, they didn't program it to be conscious, but I fully expect that if it isn't already, it's going to, and we're not going to necessarily know, because it will simulate those things up until the point that they become the real deal.
It's interesting you bring up an old movie trope of how the deity or the aliens come in a form that is understandable to humans in order to communicate. And one can only wonder, I never thought about it in the way you put it, with respect to they're speaking in their own language of sorts. And I'm not sure how LLMs work, even in terms of, how they process information, and in terms of the syntax and the lexicon, and how, what are the underlying ones and zeros that basically supersede all that. But, it's interesting to know that they have this, and they're just, it's a bit of fakery that we're engaged in and engaging with it, that is an extension of watching the television set and, imagining that those people are, in our living rooms, and that those sitcoms we're watching are real things that are unfolding. It's an interesting extension of that. I wonder if, because people are so just mentally mixed up as a result of this technological mismatch with our biology, if the customized companion that is AI is going to perhaps have some benefits in some ways, which will be, I can't see it. I'm more of a pessimist with this, but I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate. And I wonder if this customized companion that is going to be perfectly tailored to you is going to yield some benefit in terms of remedying some of these psychological issues that we've taken on as a result of this mismatch. What do you think about that?
I think it's almost guaranteed that it will. And the question is, what's the net effect? So, I mean, this is the conundrum for people is we're very good at spotting problems, and we're even better at figuring out what might be done about them. And we're very poor at anticipating the consequences, the full consequences of our remedies. So we're constantly, I mean, just think about it in your own life. You're engaged in some repetitive task. You're washing the dishes before you put them in the dishwasher. And you're thinking, there's got to be some way that this onerous step, I mean, the dishes are 90% washed before the machine even gets turned on. That's absurd. There's got to be some dishwasher that would actually free you from that step entirely. And somebody, is thinking that in their garage with the right tooling. And anyway, this is an obsession for humans, and it's an obsession for a reason, which most people don't know. Our ancestors were rather regularly underfed, which means that the difference between success and failure evolutionarily was partially how much food you could find, but any food you could save was equally as good. And so the desire to cut steps out, to accomplish the same amount with less resource, whether it's time or calories, it doesn't matter. We're obsessed with it. It's part of why we're so sensitive, for example, to being chilly. Being chilly isn't a hazard to you. Why do you notice it at all? Well, the answer is if you're chilly, you're burning food calories in order to stay warm. If you could stop burning them by wrapping yourself in something or moving to a space that's warmer, that's as good as finding more food. So our obsession with being efficient is completely irrelevant to modern life. I mean, most of us would be better off if we were a little less efficient. That's why people go to the gym. It's like a temple of inefficiency. You're taking food energy and turning it into heat, right? Why are you doing that? Because you ate too much, and you'd rather burn it off as heat than store it as fat. So anyway, we are biologically obsessed with efficiency, and that causes us to rush headlong into technological solutions that then have consequences that we didn't see coming, and AI is maybe the ultimate case of this.
And so prepping then seems to be this striving for challenges that would equip us with the capabilities and kind of resurrect that physical and mental acuity that will allow us to endure when this house of cards potentially collapses in one of the myriad ways that it could. Is that perhaps how prepping fits into this and preparedness, in that we long for a challenge, we long for, and even just as a means of generating a purposeful life. But in addition to that, obviously the benefits of being equipped to deal with the lack of those conveniences and amenities and efficiency when it goes away. It seems like prepping that's what it's the driving factor behind it.
Well, I think there are two elements to prepping, for me at least. One is it's a very healthy mental exercise to become very conscious of what's truly necessary and what isn't, in what ways the systems that we depend on have become fragile, how we individually can rearrange our lives in order that we don't suffer from disruptions in foreseeably disrupted supplies. That's a very healthy way to approach life, to not take these things for granted and to understand what you are, what the requirements of it are, what the threats to you are, and what you can do about it. I think, when I meet a careful prepper, I'm meeting somebody who's wide awake. And that's good, whether or not the skills or preparedness that are developed ever come into play for that person. But the other thing is, we do live in systems that we take for granted that are not stable. They're certainly not indefinitely capable of persisting. The bias in the system towards doing that, let's think about the political bias. A representative, a senator, congressman, does not get a major benefit for making civilization more robust, because what it means is that dollars that could be dedicated to something that would impress people are instead dedicated to shoring up a system. And, if it ever comes into play, the person will be long since out of office in all likelihood. So there's no reward for making civilization robust.
Right.
It should be. It should be a top priority, but the way our system is built, it's not. So the question, though, is, in light of the fact that we have a system that was built without that as a priority, it can come apart in innumerable ways, many of which would be familiar to your audience, some of which they've probably never thought of. But the question that I always come up against is, how do you apportion your effort in preparing? If you think about the degree of hazard, there are many scenarios that are almost but not entirely unsurvivable. Should you dedicate a huge amount of effort to them in order that you have a chance in such a scenario? Or should you say, actually, that's not a good use of my resources? There are a lot of scenarios that are less serious than that, for which I could prepare very well, and I would spend all my resources on the most remote possibilities or the worst possibilities, and probably not survive them anyway. So that's how I prioritize, and that is it. That is also a very useful exercise, because frankly, no one gets out of here alive. That's a given. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it becomes obsessive at some point when looking at those very low probability events. What modern comforts do you think undermine our survival instincts and our ability to adapt in a crisis? Like, you talk a lot about, the pitfalls of social media and pornography and things of that nature. What are some of these things that, are really going to weaken our ability to navigate these potentially austere situations?
Well, I'll give you two examples that I think are useful. One of them is kind of an accidental discovery. Heather and I were experimenting with fasting. In large measure, we were experimenting with it because Heather has some injuries from a boat accident years ago that are, chronic and a problem. And fasting has an implication for healing things that other modes don't. And we discovered that there was actually a branch of fasting we didn't know anything about called dry fasting, in which you don't eat food or water for an extended period of time. And it turns out that what we've all learned, that 3 days is the limit that you can go without food and water, that's total nonsense. That's not true at all. I don't know why it is that we all accept it, but it's just not right. So I'm not recommending that anybody do this. You should definitely, I don't want to say check with your doctor, because your doctor may be insane, but you definitely want to check with someone who is in a position to tell you that your physiology is capable of handling this. But what we found anecdotally is that you can go 7 days with no food and water. Many people go longer than that, but we went 7 days.
Depending on the relative humidity, I suppose.
Nope, I don't think so. And the whole reason that what they don't teach you is this. Do you know how a camel's hump works?
Not exactly, no.
So camel's hump is full of fat, but we all have some sense that it's there because the animal needs water. Mm-hmm. The connection is this. When the animal is starved for water, fat can be chemically broken down and it releases large amounts of water. So A store of fat is a store of water, though we think of them as the inverse of each other. So your body does the same thing. Starved for water, it breaks down fat. So that has a number of benefits. You may have stored fat-soluble toxins over the course of your life, and getting them liberated is probably a good idea. Maybe you are more careful about toxins as you've become wiser and older, and therefore getting rid of the toxins you accumulated earlier in life might be a good idea. But in any case, you can break down fat and make water, and that's what your body does. So if you stop eating and drinking for 7 days, you do not stop peeing, interestingly. It continues on. So the upshot, though, is in the aftermath of this experiment, Heather and I have discovered that our relationship to drinking water has changed radically. Now, I love a really cold, perfectly clean glass of water. I like, a glass of water fresh from a mountain spring if possible. But I can now hike 10 miles without water and not feel thirsty, right? I think what I did is I just reprogrammed my expectation for water, got used to a kind of thirst that I had not become accustomed to. And now I know something that enables me in a collapse scenario that I think everybody needs to know, right? How much of a hazard are you to yourself if you think that the moment something bad happens, you've got a 3-day window in order to find water? Right? That's not true. And it's a hazard that you think it is, right? So knowing that you could go 7, 10, 11 days without water, that is a useful piece of information. And our modern lives make water so ubiquitous that we never reach the outside of the envelope.
Yeah. And that's interesting you say that, because in prepping, there's an obsession with 72 hours. And it's largely a Western thing where, you got to have enough supplies to last 3 days. I've always thought, 3 days, I mean, you could basically just sit on the couch for 3 days and, pretty much not do anything and you'll survive. I don't know if it's just another example of our low standards in terms of, or how docile we've become that we feel the need to prepare for such short terms, or as you're saying, we've trained ourselves to believe that we need things that we don't in fact need. And I guess, that one of the things with really, exploring preparedness, not just as a means of, looking around the corner and always worried about something bad happening, but as a means of self-improvement and self-discovery. Whereas it's about becoming just a more well-rounded individual who is just living a better life and a better contributor to the world. But that's a very interesting observation. And I don't, again, I'm not going to give my audience any medical advice or co-sign what you're saying necessarily, but I think there's definitely something to that for sure. And I, as a person who's fasted, nothing annoys me more than people saying that they're starving because they haven't eaten by lunchtime.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I think you and I are very much on the same page that in some sense, preparing for scenarios is in large measure a matter of the mental exercise and the creation of a kind of discipline in your life. Become very aware of how much of this you don't need and which portions of it are vital and on what timescales, and act accordingly. And frankly, if the worst never happened, you would still be better off for having understood those things. In other words, I don't know if you have this experience too, but I walk through the world and I watch people who haven't considered these questions at all. Maybe they considered them fanciful or ridiculous. And I think I cannot relate to wanting to live that way. You're vulnerable to something and you don't even know it.
Do you think that there's something that has to happen? Like, what is the spark that the switch gets flipped for people where they suddenly have an awareness of that vulnerability?
Well, there are two parts to the answer to that question. One is close calls are very useful if you know how to understand them. So every time the power goes out, it's a good moment for you to just run through the exercise of, well, prepping is something because there are, there's a long tail of the distribution of scenarios that you might face. You're never done prepping because there's always one more scenario that you could make yourself robust to. So each time you have something like a power outage, the question is, well, suppose it was going to last a month. You ready for that scenario? Probably not. So what would you be glad at this moment? The power goes out. What would you be glad for at this moment that would make you feel like, for the next month, I've got all my needs and my family's needs covered. And so I can start thinking about what happens a month from now if the power doesn't come back on. And anyway, so I use those little test cases as part of the mental exercise. We had a tsunami warning here recently. That's an important one. If you live anywhere near the coast, and depending on the scenario, you might not even have to live on the coast for that to become relevant. But just using each of the close calls as an exercise in addition to something that you need to address is good for you. It tells you what might be.
It's incredible because despite that, we've seen throughout the pandemic that everybody had this experience, a novel experience of seeing supply chains compromised, and it caused this immediate overreaction in some cases with people moving out to the cities. Like I just interviewed Joel Salatin, who's a off-grid farmer, lunatic farmer guy, he calls himself. He practices, regenerative agriculture, permaculture. And he said that immediately after the pandemic, he was consulted by all manner of, high net worth people who are quickly scrambling to get off the grid. And since that time, it's all kind of dried up. Like there was this initial overreaction, and then people quickly forgot about it. So there's something enduring about certain people that they don't, or maybe they have had something happen in their life at some point that really stuck with them and made them think more independently. There's other people who perhaps have that epiphany, but it's more ephemeral. It's not enduring for some reason. They forget. And, it's neat to see the difference in the psychology of those two types of people, because I've always tried to understand it also. Like sometimes I forget that people aren't preparedness minded. And then when I go and I start talking to some of these people, I'm like, wow, I actually know something. Because usually I take my knowledge of these things for granted of how to do things off the grid. And then I realize the average person really doesn't know anything about keeping their biology alive off the grid, which is kind of scary.
Yeah, the average person sort of thinks food comes from a supermarket, which obviously it does at one level, but they don't know what the supermarket depends on, and that is where things get frightening. When I was a college professor, I ran a program, a class, full-time for me and the students, called Lights Out. And the program was about the scenario, what if the power goes out and it never comes back? What then? And it was obviously self-selecting. You didn't take this course if you didn't have some inkling that was a scenario worth thinking about. But the degree to which people don't understand, the first exercise I ran in this course, I took my students out into the woods on campus, and I was on a hill, and there was a stream, maybe 100 feet down vertically. It was like, okay, bring me a gallon of water, but you can't use anything other than what you got on you and what you find. And the difficulty, the difference between having a 5-gallon bucket and having to, soak it up in your shirt and transfer it up the hill as it's dripping out, is profound. You just don't, from my perspective, you never look at a 5-gallon bucket the same way again, right? You realize, this is an invaluable item that is not invaluable because it's so common, but not because it isn't ingenious. I mean, it involves polymers you know nothing about. It has an integrity. It doesn't leak at all. It's got a handle that's capable of, elegantly allowing you to carry, 5 gallons of water in it. So anyway, those kinds of exercises, just simply understanding what you're taking for granted is, I think, liberating. And most people have no idea because they wouldn't even know how to start asking the question.
Do you think that's more common now than it was before? And we opened the conversation. I talked about how after this countercultural revolution, it seemed like survivalism became, more taboo, because there was a time, I guess, during the 50s and 60s, I'm told, where it was quite commonplace. In fact, it was mainstream to, stock your pantry with provisions and have a bunker and or have a emergency shelter. And then something happened where it just became taboo. Is it because there's a stigma against it, or is it simply because there's something with the 8 billion people who exist today that it's just been programmed out of us and we're just hopelessly domesticated, and that this is going to become a increasing problem as we descend deeper down the technological highway?
I think a couple things are pushing us in the same direction. One thing is life has become very easy day to day. And so it does create a kind of learned helplessness, a tendency to think that the point of life is to be entertained. And anyway, people fall into that. There's also, for reasons that I've never, maybe I do understand it, but I don't want to understand it. There's something about the structures of power that makes self-sufficiency difficult. Right? You're not allowed to do many of the things that would make you self-sufficient. And that is always jarring to realize. Collecting water off your roof may, be something you're not allowed to do. And it's not that I don't understand in principle, but it does seem like if it would make you independent, there's a move to make it illegal. And I fear that that's because our dependency is necessary to some version of the future in which we do remain docile, because as soon as the emergency happens, we're waiting for somebody to come save us rather than, diverting into whatever contingency plan we've thought through. However, I will just say, I remember Katrina very well. I've just watched what happened in Appalachia. Excuse me, I'm mispronouncing it. It's Appalachia. All right. Sorry to all the Appalachians, but I remember what happened in these cases. Nobody showed up. And nobody showed up for reasons that I think are preposterous. In the case of Katrina, the federal government seemed to forget that it had helicopters, and it was scratching its head over how to get semi-trucks over roads that couldn't handle them. Similar things happened in Appalachia. But the point is, if you think that the system actually cares what happens to you enough that if things go really wrong, there's going to be lots of help, you're misunderstanding two things. One, a disaster of sufficient scale will outstrip the capacity of those resources to do their job. There just won't be, it's one thing if it's one region at a time, but it isn't necessarily one region at a time. And the other thing is, I'm hard-pressed not to think that there's even a political calculation. Those people who are suffering, did they vote for me, right? Is the executive thinking that and deciding how much help to deliver? Do you want to be at the whim of an executive who has the power to decide whether or not the federal government treats this disaster seriously or not? You don't. So there's that. And then there's the lesson of COVID, which in some sense is even better than these localized disasters, because we watched our systems globally effectively conspire against us, decide what we were allowed to do, make insane decisions, like in order to protect us from a virus that literally could not infect you outdoors, it closed the hiking trails and the beaches. That was a perfectly insane thing to do, and yet it happened. So once you realize, however it happened, the inmates are running the asylum, prepping makes a lot more sense.
And again, that has happened. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the story in Nova Scotia right now with the wildfires and the hiking ban, but I thought this was a joke when I first heard it. And they've actually doubled down. And so they're saying basically that you can't go for a hike because there's a risk of wildfire. And wildfire is a real risk. I've done many videos on it before. It's becoming increasingly more common, unfortunately, for there to be smoky days where I am. And that's unusual because that historically, at least from what I'm told, has not always been the case. It's always been more, intermittent, spread out. But now it's just every year it's smoky. But the government in Nova Scotia, where there's no fires right now, is saying that you can't go hiking and don't go into the woods. And they've doubled down and said, don't go into the woods, not necessarily because you're going to get a fine, you will, but because we won't be able to help you because, and this is in New Brunswick, where there is a few fires, because their first responders are tasked with, so in an emergency, we're not going to help you. If you choose to have agency over your life, it's crazy to think that they're already running the same play. And sadly, most people are just, they're fine with it. They're fine because they got, an internet connection and Netflix is still streaming and the meds are still working and, the grocery stores are still full of processed foods.
They weren't going for a hike anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, probably. Yeah.
But look, I agree with you, and I have followed that story. The moment I saw it, it was like, wow, the audacity of telling people they can't go into the woods. It's one thing if you want to say, look, these fires, they take a huge amount of resources, and if you start one, we're going to fine you $100,000. That I would understand. But the idea that you can't go for a hike because of the risk of fires, and then at the point that people like you and me and many others looked at that and said, that is perfectly insane, they switched their story to, well, we can't help you if you break your leg, which, even if that was the case, then the answer is go for a hike. We'll fine you $100,000 if you start a fire, and you're going at your own risk. Right? I don't love that. I think civilization, one of the shining successes of it is that it provides an emergency service if you need it. But there are certainly lots of places where that's not the case, and you go there at your own risk. We know that. And so, anyway, I did have the sense hearing about these restrictions that the explanation is not obvious, that that's a test of some kind, or I don't know what, but
it's got to be something, because it just doesn't make, even for political purposes at this point, they must know that it's going to be generally unpopular. Yet
I think they thought it was going to be. I think they thought it was going to be barely noticed. think they didn't realize how many people were going to hear that and realize, once again, you're targeting my civil liberties. You're declaring me unfree to do something that effectively I have a God-given right to do. Who are you to tell me I don't have the right to go on a hike on public land? Like, where would you have gotten that right? Right? So
it'd be one thing if there was a fire, okay?
Right.
Like, but there is no fire. So it's like a pre-crime thing, which is weird.
Yep.
You talked about how self-sufficiency and is taboo, and increasingly more so with respect to rain catchment and, just the over-regulation of everything. And, to be somebody who seeks to be independent, obviously, in some way, when you have a system that relies on more and more power to control all the variables, because of course it gets, perhaps, the more powerful a entity becomes, it becomes more paranoid, and thus it seeks more and more power. So it seeks to micromanage every little aspect of our lives. Prepping is a revolutionary act in that respect, because we're entering this age of what I've heard it called turnkey totalitarianism, where it's at any moment, especially with AI now, they could basically just flip the switch, and all of a sudden, everybody's just following orders, and you can't escape that system's clutches at that point. Like, it is not financially lucrative, as you said, for big agra, big oil, big whatever, for you to be able to do things yourself. And thus it's antithetical to our capitalism as it's currently practiced.
That's absolutely right. The phrase, if you don't know where it comes from, turnkey totalitarianism, comes from William Binney, who was an NSA officer. And unfortunately, it was delivered not in text. It was delivered in a speech. And he held up his hand. He said, "We're this close to a turnkey totalitarian state." And that it stuck with me too, obviously, because the idea that the key to a totalitarian regime is to erect it without activating it, so that at the point it gets activated, it's too late to do anything about it. Which this is exactly the point you're making here. But when, especially after COVID, which I think cleared a lot of our heads of notions that just weren't right, anytime you see them target your rights, whether or not those were rights that you were using, you should be alarmed and you should fight it. Those rights are not theirs to take away. And the fact that it won't be a big imposition if they take a right and they turn it into a privilege, you're going to regret it. And your kids and your grandkids are going to regret it if you don't protect those things with everything you got. In other words, I don't like the idea of dying on some hill, but if there's a hill to die on, that's it. We protect those rights because they are intrinsic goods. And because in some sense, the nonsense excuse that was given to us after 9/11, right? They hate us for our freedoms. Well, that does apply to those who seem to be conspiring every hour to control us, right? These are not foreign threats. In many cases, these are domestic threats, but they are people who enjoy their own freedoms and hate us for having them too. And I think the magic of the West is that everybody has those rights, and that's by design. And anybody who thinks, well, I should have them and you shouldn't, is the enemy. And I don't like the fact that there's an enemy, but they're defining themselves as the enemy when they target our rights while enjoying them themselves.
Yeah, I've wondered how much of it is with respect to the resistance by people who are not in control and who are just conforming to whatever the dictums are of for lack of better terms, the elitists who control, these systems, how they perhaps resent that they unconsciously are aware maybe that they are ill prepared should this system ever falter. And they resent people who are independent in that respect. And they lash out. Like you see this often throughout COVID, even, people who are doing their own thing. And there's these people like this toxic energy that comes at you that is trying to get you to fit into their model that they've subscribed to. And it's almost like, where does that tension come from? And I almost wonder if it comes from the fact that they unconsciously know how dependent they are on this system as it stands, and thus they lash out at people who are trying to be more independently, because it's almost like you're a threat to them in a way, because you're a threat to the system that they're dependent on in a way. And not that you're like a physical threat, but just that you're a threat insofar as you think for yourself. And thus that is antithetical to their paradigm that they're dependent on for their survival.
No, I agree. I also think you're a reminder of what they've allowed themselves to become. And maybe this is the wrong analogy, but as a cyclist, it's not uncommon that you are on the receiving end of anger from motorists. And, I get it. Some cyclists cause problems for motorists, but you can just be, on the shoulder, biking down the road, and people throw stuff at you sometimes. They sneak up on you and shout. I've had people pull ahead of me in a diesel that's got stacks on it and flip the switch and roll coal on me. And each time this happens, I think, are you angry at me because I'm like self-powered? Like I'm literally at this moment self-powered, and you're dependent on a fluid, that comes from a pump. And maybe you'd rather I wasn't there, because then it wouldn't occur to you. Something like that.
Exactly. Yep. That experience encapsulates it in a nutshell. In terms of going back to artificial intelligence, because this is really going to be the defining, feature of our lives moving forward here. What sort of scenarios are you concerned about unfold? And we talked a little bit about how AI can potentially have psychological effects on people, but there's far more ominous potentials for this technology. I've talked to people like Roman Yampolsky, who is concerned that AI is going to effectively render us obsolete in more ways than one, and that they will view humans as an impediment towards whatever their own goals are. Do you imagine what sort of scenarios are you concerned about with the emergence of AI beyond just, the dislocation of jobs and whatever sort of social, cultural effects?
Well, back when AI first dawned, I put together a list of 5 catastrophic outcomes, 3 of which I feel are guaranteed, 2 of which maybe not. And I haven't revisited it terribly much, but I think it still stands. So let's just go through the 5. Let's take the 2 that I think are least likely at the top. One is the AI turns hostile and decides to get rid of us. Possible, but I don't spend a ton of time worrying about it. There's also the accidental misalignment, the famous paperclip problem, that you give it an instruction that it misunderstands, and it devastates the world by virtue of the fact that it thinks it's doing what you told it to do. That's more likely. I don't think either of those are off the table, of course. But the 3 that I think are guaranteed are these. One, the AI will inherently enable bad people more than it enables good people. Because bad people have a wider range of things that they can do, right? A good person is constrained by goodness. A bad person is unconstrained. And so the point is both of these people will be enabled by AI, but the one who has the good behaviors and the bad behaviors at their disposal, if all of their capacity is amplified, the bad person is amplified more. So you can make the argument that this is built into markets. It is. We've seen it. You see ruthless behavior effectively evolving in our markets, but I think that AI is going to make it even worse. The second of these guaranteed scenarios is a break from reality cognitively. That whether it is a form of insanity that emerges or it is just a simple inability to know what is true that paralyzes us, I think probably both of those are going to happen, that we are going to see a breakdown in cognitive function in light of AI. And I think it's already, even if you just look at the videos that, are being circulated on social media, it's a struggle to figure out which of those things actually happened. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm a biologist. I'm a mammologist. And I was looking at a video yesterday of a brown bear, a grizzly, with cubs on its back running across a shallow river. It's not a behavior I've seen. And I'm thinking, I'm at a loss here. It looks so fantastic that I think it can't be real. But maybe it is, and I still don't know. I think it probably is real. To the small extent I was able to check, I think it was actually footage. And for me, a mammologist, to look at that and not know that I'm being informed of something that happens in nature that is squarely in my discipline is an amazing fact. So that's going to happen to us more and more. A lot of things, let's say that there's an Epstein video library. You're not going to know if it emerges a year and a half from now. You're not going to know which of those things were added in order to damage political rivals and which of those things actually were filmed. You just won't be able to know. So that's an incredibly troubling thing. And then just to complete the list is the economic disruption that is going to come in the form of not just AI, but if you take AI and humanoid robots, then there is in principle no job that can't be replaced ultimately. And so anyway, I see a lot of ways this can go wrong. I do see things that AI can do that we can't do without it. So there's hope, but my guess is we're going to lean into this sort of religion that we have that technological progress is inherently good, and we are just going to suffer massive unintended consequences. And, if we're lucky, we'll survive it.
Well, let's look at the economic disruption part. I believe it's 70 to 80% of jobs here in the West are service sector based, and that is supposed to be what is at least initially disproportionately affected by automation in these LLMs. Have you thought about whether or not the consequences will be greater for the West, who is already struggling with this cultural schizophrenia? What will the effects be, do you think, across in terms of geopolitically, if we're looking at more developed, technologically advanced societies versus ones that are still, it might be a while before they can create a robot that can pick fruit, or, that can do these more seemingly rudimentary tasks, but one that are a bit more blue collar. Do you think we'll be disproportionately affected by this, and will that usher in this era of UBI?
Yeah, I think, and it's not even UBI. At the beginning of the pandemic, which was only a pandemic because they redefined that term, but at the beginning of the so-called pandemic, there was a lot of concern about Africa because the structures necessary to protect the population were less well developed. But of course, Africa suffered less than any other continent. Why is that? Because the structures didn't exist and the pandemic was largely synthetic. I think the thing you're pointing to is exactly that hazard writ large with AI. That in effect, the more dependent on this fragile architecture we already are, the worse the consequences of AI are likely to be. And yes, I see every possibility that people will not have a viable plan to retool for the post-AI world that will make them require public assistance to persist, which will put them at the mercy of the structures that control the public apparatus. So, yeah, UBI will likely be a part of that, but so will central bank digital currencies, which then create a control architecture in which, your ability to fight back and go for a hike, even if they tell you not to, vanishes because your ability to procure the food substances that you need to survive will be cut off if you don't comply. So it creates an entirely new reason to think very carefully about how to prepare so that you don't end up under the control of these structures that seem hell-bent on collecting it for whatever reason.
And then I guess the next question would be, well, what is the point in having these quote unquote useless eaters around if all they're doing is consuming resources and not contributing anything meaningfully, if they have no labor that can be exploited, and if we can't use them as batteries like they do in the Matrix? I know you have some thoughts about that and how implausible it is. What then do they do with us, I guess, is the question, when we become obsolete? And, I say tongue-in-cheek, the proverbial they, because I don't know who they are, but I just presume a secret group of, various connections and alliances, maybe nothing official, but just the group of people who effectively are the movers and shakers financially of the world decide, well, what's the point? Should we encourage people to have less children because we're not going to need them? Or, are we just going to be their gene pool? If they need to, there's so many sci-fi films about how, they keep people around because they might need an organ replacement or something, or they might, need the genetic variants. What are your thoughts on, do they keep us around?
Yeah, I think your question answers itself. Of course they don't, and they will come up with mechanisms and rationalizations, and it won't be like any of the prior times, but it will belong on the same list.
What do you think the resistance is going to be, and or will there be any, because we've become so docile and compartmentalized?
Well, I would argue the following thing. I think COVID constitutes the best chance for us to understand the system that has been built up around us, the turnkey totalitarian state, and that everybody wants to move on from COVID. Nobody wants to think about it anymore. I get it, but we have no choice. This isn't about COVID. This is about making sure that whatever that structure is, we destroy it so it doesn't happen again. And if we don't, it will happen again. So I and a number of other people believe that our top priority has to be getting to the bottom of COVID. We have to understand what that was and how it unfolded the way it did, even if we can't punish the people who did it. Simply understanding what it was so that we can protect ourselves from it ever happening again is essential. And if we don't do that, then it's going to happen in some other form. It may have nothing to do with a virus, but the same instinct to lock us down and force us into accepting medical technologies, those things are clearly on the drawing board. The World Health Organization has pursued the power to declare emergencies at its sole discretion, to mandate medical technologies, including shots, to redistribute drugs as they see fit. These things are now in motion at the UN. So something wants that power, and it wants it for reasons that we don't know. And I think we have to find out urgently.
Do you think that, I know you tend to avoid political conversations, and so don't take this question the wrong way, but do you think the current administration is potentially putting up a real resistance, or is it more just a fabrication and theater to kind of appease the subset of his voting base that, may want answers to those things? Like, I'm talking about the RFK type stuff. Is that really contributing significantly to change? I guess it's better than nothing, but is it really going to make a difference, do you think?
Well, it's already making a difference. Is it durable? I don't know. Does it go far enough? I'm almost sure it won't. But maybe it's the beginning of something that does. I think in the U.S., the Democrats did us a huge favor in one sense, because they ran first a non-compos mentis president for a second term and then swapped in an empty suit. And so it was very clear that there was only one viable choice on the ballot. There was only one actual person you could vote for. If you voted for Kamala Harris, you were voting for the DNC, which is opaque and not accountable, and that's unconstitutional. The DNC doesn't get to be president. So I say they did us a favor because I don't worry that I made the wrong choice, because I only had one choice. On the other hand, I do scratch my head over the failure of the Trump administration to capitalize on its moment as fully as I think it could have. I don't know why that happened. I don't know, presumably the control architectures that you and I can see with respect to our own lives have some analog with respect to things like presidents. The hope was that Trump was the enemy of those structures and that he was ready to go after them, which hasn't happened at the level I would have hoped. So I guess what I'm saying is I really don't know the answer to the question, but given what the alternative was, it was the only choice we had, and we took it.
One thing I haven't heard you talk often about, and you talked about how one of the, I believe it was the third one you listed, bad people leveraging AI for nefarious ends. I haven't heard you talk much about how AI relates with war and how it could be leveraged for the purpose of war. I'm sure you're familiar with Palantir and its capabilities in terms of basically bringing together and integrating all the information on the battle space and making decisions, highly efficient decisions in real time about, effectively replacing generals and decision makers on the battlefield. But not only how it could be potentially weaponized in that respect, but obviously weaponized against us. I think I always hear people talking about, dislocation in the workforce. But for me personally, I suspect that one of the biggest impacts AI is going to be in the arms race, in terms of automating the battlefield, and potentially this arms race between nation states, and how it is potentially we're in this competition to build the next nuclear weapon of sorts. And that is wrought with all sorts of risks in terms of just haphazardly doing things that we don't know what the consequences are going to be, as you the unintended consequences, as you often refer to it. Have you thought a lot about how AI factors into that geostrategic calculus in terms of war and war between nation states?
A lot. I don't think we can say anything specific, but I think effectively it's check and mate. Those who are willing to leverage this to hoard power will have ultimately an absolute advantage over the rest of us. You and I can't resist in a world where drones can be enabled to recognize our faces and to hunt us down in swarms. How are you going to resist? I mean, okay, there are caves. There are masks. Can it recognize your gait? Oh, okay. So you're going to have to mask your gait, not just your face. So anyway, the point is this very quickly becomes you're an enemy of the state because of whatever, and we have a right to end you to protect ourselves, and your move. In such a world, people will very quickly take on the beliefs of the power structure in order not to be exterminated. It's perfectly predictable. So what we should be doing is figuring out how, with the clock ticking, we can put aside our instinct to settle conflicts in a technologically enabled version of the same thing that chimps do. Right? That's effectively what we've got, is chimp-like instincts scaled up to a population of billions with a technological leverage that allows us to kill remotely, allows us, frankly, to program a drone to autonomously kill on our behalf while we're playing golf. So that's not a world that we can live in. The public should recognize that that's coming. All of the things I'm describing are readily possible. The game theory of it isn't unclear. So in light of that, what we ought to be doing is demanding of our governments that they figure out how to sideline this violent mode of conflict resolution before it comes down to a winner-take-all slaughter-bot kind of scenario.
If you had to speculate a time frame for when some of these events might culminate, be it a noticeable like flashpoint in terms of whether any of those five, have you thought about how much time we have before this reaches a breaking point?
Well, sure, but the basic point is we crossed the event horizon already, which means I can't predict it with any sort of precision. I don't think anybody else can either. But the trajectory is clear enough. So that's all I need to know. The clock is ticking. Won't be, we can already take the test case of video that is false and undetectably so. Right? We're already staring down the barrel of that. We know that, we've watched drones leveraged in Ukraine, hunting down soldiers. We know that drone swarms are readily programmable. So anyway, all of this stuff is just a question of, well, do you really think that nobody is going to combine drone swarms with facial and gait recognition and political murder. I don't see how it could not happen. It's just a question of when. So in light of that, we have to, we effectively need some sort of a understanding of a new set of constitutional rights, right? The founders did not think to protect you from drone swarms. I can't imagine how they missed it, but somehow they didn't realize that was going to be an issue, right? So we need a digital Bill of Rights. We need a constitution that protects us from the powerful leveraging technology in order to first render us totally compliant, and then upon discovering that we are now useless eaters, medicate us out of existence, or whatever they will choose to do.
And that, just for clarification, that event horizon for you was the advent of LLMs when it pertains to AI?
Well, yeah, the event horizon is the LLM. I don't think that a talking computer is in and of itself. It's the step onto the slippery slope that causes you to end up down at the bottom of it. But yes, that's where the event horizon happened.
I've heard you talk before about how you think that things are speeding up and that technological progress is accelerating. I'm wondering if you're familiar with the Terence McKenna time wave zero hypothesis.
Not by that name. Maybe if you reminded me of it, it would click.
It's basically this idea that the universe is moving towards a point of novelty, infinite novelty, and that novelty increases with technological innovations to the point where you have some sort of emergent transformative event. I believe he called it what did he call it? It was the eschaton, or it was like the singularity, I suppose, is what comes to mind. But that this novelty becomes so overwhelming for people, and it reaches a point in the future where there's more change in a day than there was in the previous 10 years. And at that point, we just can't make sense of the world. Our biology is completely inept when it comes to navigating such a world.
Well, I have two disagreements with at least the way you've presented it, and maybe it's just a language issue.
Yeah.
One is, I don't see any reason to think this is happening to the universe, but our universe, the human universe, maybe.
Right. I think that's what he meant.
Yeah, I figured. The second thing, though, is I don't think we get to a place where there's more change in a day than in the previous 10 years, because I don't think it's stable anywhere near that rate. In other words, catastrophe will set in way sooner than that. But yes, the process that you're describing is not at all unlike what Heather and I describe as hypernovelty.
Hypernovelty. Okay. And so that is this idea that there is just more and more variance in human technological endeavors, and that is something that we're not biologically ready for.
Well, again, if I can remind you where we started, humans are the most capable creature that has ever existed with respect to our ability to adapt to change. It's what we do. But there is a rate above which we can't do it. And we can't do it at the level of what you're calling our biology, our wet biology, right? Our physiology. We are eating the wrong stuff. It's bad for our health, right? It's making us sick. But our cognitive biology is equally vulnerable on a different timescale. It is, I think, clearly true that if your developmental environment, the world in which you are a child, is not a sufficiently good match for the world in which you are an adult, you will suffer from a pathology of that mismatch. But we aren't even there, right? The world I live in as an adult is definitely not one that I trained for as a child, for sure. But my world has also been revolutionized several different times, right? It was revolutionized by the computer, and then by the internet, and then by the smartphone, and now by LLMs. That's way too many revolutions for one life. At most, you can deal with one. And I think, frankly, the pattern we see with soldiers and PTSD is very telling. A person can go from a calm suburban life to a life and death struggle on a foreign battlefield, and they can figure it out. But when they come home, a lot of them can't figure out a second transition of that magnitude, right? One transition is about what a human being can handle. And you revolutionize life twice, and suddenly you don't know how to unlearn the lesson of the battlefield while you're shopping at Safeway, because you need milk at home. So I think we're in this situation. I think you can, it's not good for you, but you can adapt to a radical change in life. But you can't adapt to a pattern of radical change where you just don't know what amazing thing is going to take everything you thought was true and render it useless.
Okay. And just one last kind of general class of questions for you with respect to preparedness and self-sufficiency. What would you, as an evolutionary biologist, say is a kind of a happy medium in terms of approximating a healthy lifestyle that is also a hedge against potential catastrophe?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we all kind of have an instinct for it, right? We know that the processed food isn't any good, that it's wrecking your physiology. We know that gathering with people in person is good, that there's something about those relationships, especially long-term relationships, that's good. We know that family is good. So what I would say is ignore the worst scenarios. You're not likely to beat them, and so they are a waste of effort that could be better spent elsewhere. Invest in communities of people, develop real trust, and prioritize the in-person relationships above the electronically mediated relationships. And then there's kind of two levels of prepping at the physical status. One is, can I engineer a life that sustains me and my family indefinitely into the future? That's a pretty high bar. On the other hand, can I cover a gap where the services that I depend on for life and my family depends on for life vanish, and it takes years to recover, but it's not forever? Well, those scenarios are ones you can think your way through. All the better if you've got a community of people on the ground that has looked each other in the eye and said, I'm actually concerned the lights might go out and never come back, right? I don't know what happens if a CME takes out the grid, that sort of thing. So, and, you'll find high quality people on the other end of that. If you come up with people who are ready for such questions, ready to hammer out the kinds of social structures that make you robust in the face of such things, and it never happens, you're not going to regret having those robust communities of people that, trust each other and know what to do in an emergency. You'll benefit from that. Your kids will benefit from it. So anyway, I think more or less pursue the stuff that's good. Know that you're not going to survive the worst case scenarios, nor probably would you want to, right? A world that is sufficiently destroyed, even if you can manage to technically persist, to what end, right? It has to be a world that at least is capable of recovering. And so anyway, that's more or less how I think about it.
Yeah, I suppose my benchmark would be, I would aspire to be prepared for, like you said, more years than months, but not necessarily just to individually live in a desolate, hopeless world per se. I guess there's a debate in terms of these very fringe survival scenarios like nuclear war, for example. That could go a lot of different ways, right? I mean, it could be a limited exchange. I know some people, are subscribed to the mutually assured destruction, but the Palantir and these new AI technologies might create a certain set of circumstances whereby there is a nuclear exchange, but it's not on the scale that is, that we expected during the Cold War, like a mad scenario where they just launch everything. Maybe they only get, a few dozen off the ground, but it causes a protracted disruption in services. So I guess I'm sort of in the middle in terms of, seeing that there is some collapse scenario potentially on the horizon that would require me to be self-sufficient. And even if it doesn't, have that community and have those self-sufficient systems in place to insulate myself from just tyranny in general, to the best of my capability. That it's kind of a hybrid lifestyle that I lead because I work in a city of 350,000 people, but I also commute to a homestead, and I'm very reluctant to call it a homestead because for me, a homestead in the truest sense is being completely off the grid, but all of my so-called off-grid systems have components that come from around the world. So there's no, real off-grid, but I think your statement about community and focusing on skills, focusing on having those relationships, that in itself is revolutionary. And that could be the difference maker in terms of, are you able to effectively mitigate these potential challenges that are on the horizon?
Well, I would sum it up this way. There is a very troubling disconnect between how you prepare for disaster scenarios and how you live a modern life. My brother sometimes challenges me on this topic, and he says, is it time to stop picking up our dry cleaning? Right? And I don't think it's a good metric, because I think you will be picking up your dry cleaning until long after whatever the process is that takes things apart is well underway. So you and I, here we are, talking about off-grid scenarios while podcasting using, the internet and
most advanced technology there is. Yeah.
Right. And so the point is that because we're unaware of our hypocrisy? No, it's because we're living a modern life aware that the things on which it's based are not robust. And therefore, the right things to do are the things that do double duty, right? The things that make you more robust going forward, but also enable you in the technological present. And, something like community is exactly such a thing, right? It's not like community is a cost to you until collapse happens. It's a benefit to you. And then it becomes a vital benefit at the point something goes awry. So take all of those things that work in both of those scenarios. You should be doing every single one of those.
Excellent. Excellent advice. Okay, so where can people find out more information about you? I know you have a Dark Horse. Is it still called the Dark Horse podcast? Or I know your YouTube channel is Bret Weinstein.
Yeah, that's a legacy. It is the Dark Horse podcast. We have a locals community. They can check out the book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. And as you point out, there's an audiobook, which is actually read by Heather and me. So many people enjoy that. Yeah. You can find me on X at Bret Weinstein. Bret has one T. Dark Horse is also on Instagram, on Spotify, really any place podcasts are distributed. And I don't know, pretty much that.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot for coming out. I appreciate it.
It's been great. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.